The Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph, The Soiling of Old Glory, taken in 1976 by Stanley Forman, is a profoundly powerful statement, depicting a white South Boston Irish teen, Joseph Rakes, thrusting the tip of the American flag into a black lawyer named Ted Landsmark. To understand this photo and the anger captured in this photo, you need to know why this white teenager was angry and decided to take it out on a man who was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. W. Arthur Grady ruled the way that schools in the Boston area were racially imbalanced was unconstitutional and passed the Racial Imbalance Act and wanted to begin busing immediately. Many residents were very angry at Judge Grady's proposal. It led to riots and protests that resulted in many deaths and injuries. But before we get into the riots, we need to understand how the residents in South Boston lived and why they would riot over desegregation. The residents of the South Boston Project, specifically Old Colony, were primarily white residents of Irish ancestry. These residents lived in poverty and below imperfect conditions. However, the residents perceived it to be a paradise. Life was hard for the children and teenagers growing up in the South Boston projects in the 1970s, dealing with and witnessing problems such as child abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, and domestic and gang violence. But despite these problems, it was a proud community. South Boston residents, most notably teenage boys, cut their hair a certain way, keeping it slicked back, and got a tattoo to let people know they were from Selfie. This particular tattoo was known as the Selfie dot and was a triangular dot pattern resembling a shamrock on the wrist. People in these neighborhoods in South Boston projects lived close to one another, and it was a type of neighborhood where everyone knew each other and stuck up for each other. In South Boston in the early 1970s, it was a predominantly white community where racism and segregation were very prevalent. The Boston schools were racially imbalanced at the time. 13 city schools were at least 90% black. However, the Boston School Committee refused to acknowledge the segregation. Frequent use of derogatory language was a common way to put people down, and individuals held racist beliefs against others of different races. These beliefs were passed on from generation to generation. The N-word was used mainly as a system of class by whites in these South Boston projects to refer to whites of other projects that they believed to be lower of them, and at the bottom of the system of class were blacks living in neighborhoods like Roxbury. However, the way the South Boston residents behaved regarding race was extremely hypocritical. Many residents claimed Irish identity, a race that has been the target of racism and cruelty from British like Oliver Cromwell and has also been targeted by hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. However, for the lower-class white people who lived in these projects, their skin color was one of the only things they had going for them, and was one of the only things that made them feel proud and dignified. Now knowing what life was like for residents in South Boston, it's time to move on to how the busing crisis began. In 1974, Judge W. Grady Jr. of the Federal District Court ordered schools in the Boston area to desegregate, claiming it was for the best. Officials stated that transporting students by bus to the schools outside their neighborhoods was the simplest way to achieve racial balance. This became known as busing. Supporters of busing wanted equal opportunities for all students, regardless of race. However, the majority of poor whites in the South Boston project disliked the black community and were angered by the fact that Judge Grady, a wealthy judge who lived in the suburbs, had Boston schools desegregate, but not schools in Wellesley or other suburban towns. They were angry at the fact that they were taking away this one sense of superiority they had over the black projects, their race, and the advantages they got from it. Many South Boston residents opposed desegregation and busing. Some lashed out violently against blacks, like a Haitian immigrant on the border between South Boston and Dorchester was dragged out of his car and beaten nearly to death. Like Ted Landsmark in the landmark photo, a soiling of Old Glory was beaten badly, but recovered. Also, rocks were thrown at buses that contained black students that were being bused into South Boston. But there wasn't just violence in South Boston, too. In Roxbury, a white woman was burned to death. All of these people at the wrong place at the wrong time. But there were also confrontations in high school between the students of different races, like food fights, fistfights, and stabbings. The police also reacted violently to the strikes that got violent by beating several of the protesters who turned violent. The reality of this profoundly powerful statement, The Soiling of Old Glory by Stanley Forman, was really about this boy being poor. He was mad at the fact Grady, a rich man, took away this poor kid's only slice of superiority, his only paradise he had. His only superiority was that he was white, and they were afraid that if they busted students and made them equal and gave them equal opportunities, their superiority would be taken away and they'd both just be poor.